I'm Muska Ulhak, and I'm the Director of Programming at Social Innovation Canada. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Investment Readiness webinar. We will start the event shortly, but before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Today, we as a community are gathering in a digital realm from many individual spaces. Together, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we operate is located on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. I am joining you from the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Wyandot Nations. And now I would like to pass it to Andrea Nimtan, our CEO at Social Innovation Canada, to provide some additional remarks. Over to you, Andrea.
Thanks, and thank you, Muska. I'm also joining from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I'm grateful to them and many of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples who have stewarded this land for a long time immemorial. This webinar is part of our investment readiness programming in partnership with the ESDC. And the goal of the program is to strengthen Canada's social finance and social innovation ecosystem to create opportunities and resources and connections for our social purpose organizations to become investment ready. We will be doing more webinars, and we also have a social finance newsletter that was designed to try and bring voices of investors and investees, ecosystem builders, and opportunities into one place in a monthly piece of news. So please, I'm sure that someone will put the link in the chat, and we hope you'll join it and give us feedback to see if it's useful for you. Today, as Muska said, we are very excited to be highlighting employee ownership trusts. Employee ownership trusts are a wonderful example of a solution that could meaningfully address wealth inequality and actually create systemic change in this country. They're proven success. They have a huge amount of political will behind them. And they're one of those things that you hear about and you think about and you go, oh, well, that makes sense. Let's do that. We've got a big transfer of companies. We've got challenges around things sort of just kind of petering out. People need jobs. And these folks today, we have an incredible panel who are going to share a little bit more about their potential, talk a bit about the structural barriers they're facing to implementations, as well as specifically in terms of policy changes. We've got Tiara, Letourneau from Rewrite Capital Advisors. Muska is going to give you more fulsome introductions to each of these. John Schell, many of you will know from Social Capital Partners. Chad Friesen from Friesen Corporations. David Fitz-gerald from Carris Reels. They are all going to share their insights on the current state of work in Canada and the Canadian Ownership Coalition. And we're hoping to learn about specific considerations for small businesses and social purpose organizations and why this is all meaningful to you here in the audience. So without further ado, thank you all for joining us, and over to you, Muska.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So very quickly in terms of the overall flow of this event, we will start with a brief presentation by Tiara Letourneau, CEO of Rewrite Capital Advisors. Following the presentation, there will be an engaging panel discussion with important insights and perspectives from the rest of the speakers. We also have an audience Q&A segment at the end of the panel, so please add your questions in the chat box. And just some additional housekeeping notes, we have live French language closed captioning available for those of you looking to have this feature visible on your end. Please select the show captions on your screen and click the up caret button to select translate to and choose your desired language from the drop-down menu. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded, and if you experience any technical difficulties throughout the session, please reach out to my colleagues Kathleen and Alex using the chat feature, and we'll be able to assist you. We also have a very short survey at the end of the session, so please kindly stick around for another few seconds just towards the end to help us fill that out. And now it's my absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce Tiara Letourneau. Tiara is the CEO of Rewrite Capital Advisors, an investment and advisory company focused on helping mid-sized companies transition to 100% employee ownership. Tiara has extensive experience in finance and operational strategy. She holds a Master's of Finance from Cambridge University. She's also a member of the steering committee of the Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition. Thank you so much, Tiara, for joining us, and now over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Muska. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm always delighted to talk about the possibility for employee ownership in Canada. I'd like to kick it off by talking about the Canadian environment that we're in. And many of you, you have a background in social innovation, and so you're very aware of it. But Canada has an income and wealth inequality problem, and it's something that has been growing for the past 40 years. So normally when we think about inequality, we refer to income inequality, and the focus tends to be on those who have the most. So everybody's focused on the 1% or the 10% and how much more they have. But what's really interesting to me is if you look at the composition of the bottom 50%, it really hasn't changed at all in the last 40 years. Basically, if you're in that bottom 50%, it's getting harder and harder for you to exit that. It's really a place where people get stuck. And so that's something that, is really not talked about enough. People tend to talk about the disparity, but they don't talk about people getting stuck in the bottom half of that tail. And the second thing that people don't tend to talk about when they talk about inequality is wealth inequality. But wealth inequality is really rising in this country. It's something that's getting worse generation by generation. So that is how much money that an individual or a family has to be able to invest. This is particularly important because Canada is a mature economy. And in a mature economy, the growth rate is almost always lower than the rate of return on investment. So that means if you have money saved that you can invest, that's going to grow faster than the money that you would earn from your labor. So it's creating a divide in this country that those who have money and have wealth are going to see their wealth increasing faster than those who don't. And the way these are connected is that folks who are low income, who don't have the ability to save additional income to invest, are being fenced out of that system. And so they're excluded from participation in the highest return that you can get in a mature capital system. So at the core of these questions in Canada is how do we allow more people to participate in earning these higher returns? How do we get capital into the hands of people who don't have the ability to save money? And that's a difficult question. So Canada has for a long time been a very redistributive country. If someone has more income, then we know how to take income away from those who have a lot and redistribute it to those who have less. But redistributing wealth is a lot harder. It's very, very tricky. You can't say, I'm going to take wealth away from those who have it and put it into the hands of those who don't. Okay, so let's talk about the Canadian business environment. We're in a really unique situation right now. In the next 10 years, 76% of all small and mid-sized businesses in Canada have indicated they intend to sell or change ownership. That equates to $2 trillion. Now, $2 trillion is a really big number, but it's hard to kind of visualize that or imagine what that means for Canada. So what I like to say to people is think of Starbucks. There's one on like every corner of every major city in Copenhagen and Cape Town and Seoul and Korea. And I mean, literally every major city that you go to around the world has Starbucks all throughout it. Now imagine that you sold all of Starbucks' global holdings. You would have to sell that 9 times to equal the amount of capital that's going to change hands in Canada in the next 10 years. So we're talking about a phenomenal change. The question is, where do we want that capital to go? And so if you think about when a business sells sells its company, you have to think about who typically are the buyers. Sometimes you have an intergenerational buyer, so the kids will take it over, but that's less and less common all the time. Sometimes you have a competitor who will come and buy the company, and that does happen. So you'll see companies doubling in size as they merge together and you have a larger company. Even more common, I would say, though, is you have a much larger company buying a smaller company. And so you can think of Warner Brothers buying an FX specialized studio, or a dairy company buying a cheese factory. And situations like that, that's called a strategic acquisition. And in a strategic acquisition, the larger company is about to pay less because it's going to in-house the service that they're getting. So your dairy will be turned into cheese for a cheaper price, or your company will be able to produce FX for a cheaper price. And that means you're willing to pay more to buy that company than a normal competitor would, because you're about to get extra value internally. So that's a strategic acquisition. And the last method is a private equity purchase. And so in private equity, right now they're sitting on just a mountain of what they call dry powder, which is money that investors have given them that they need to spend on acquiring companies because their investors are expecting a return. And right now, because there's so much money sitting under private equity waiting for them to spend, it's pushing up how much they're willing to pay for companies. What this means is that these private buyers, particularly strategic acquisitions by a larger company and private equity, are paying a premium. They're paying more for the companies than a company would get for selling it onto just, a smaller buyer. We want to say there is another solution that isn't really being talked about, and that is that owners should be allowed to sell those companies on to their employees. So this is a model that exists and is very successful in countries outside of Canada. In the United States, this was designed by a very clever individual who was a bond lawyer, and he had the foresight to say, hey, if a company can issue debt just based on the strength of its ability to make payments over time, then why can't we do that when we're transferring the company over to the employees? And basically what he came up with was a version where the employees can become the owners of a company, but the employees don't have to pay for it. The company engine that creates cash flow year over year is going to be the thing that pays for it. And so it became a really fascinating opportunity for employees to acquire companies without the employees having to buy the company, but the owner still gets paid. So this is basically what we're advocating for here in Canada. This model exists now in the United States. It was developed in the 50s, but really took off in the 70s when some policy incentives were put up against it. And it exists as well in the United Kingdom, and it was only put in place in 2014. So we've seen a real uptick since then. Now in the UK, 1 out of every 20 businesses that sells gets sold to its employees using a model like this. In this system, all employees become the owners of the company, but don't have to pay for their shares. And at the core of these structures in the US and the UK is what we call an employee ownership trust, or an ESOP trust in the US, that can hold the shares and take care of the shareholder duties on behalf of the employees. So as an employee, you're not walking around with a stock certificate. You just go to work like you always did. You continue to do the job that you've always done. And the trust is now holding all the shares, and the benefit from those shares comes back to the employees. So ultimately, they become the beneficiaries of this model. So there are 5, let's talk a little bit about how this is done. So first of all, this is almost never a startup structure. Okay, this isn't the kind of structure that you would do if you were a startup company and you were just at the inception. This really is designed as a succession planning tool for companies that are already established and that are looking to sell. And instead of selling on to a larger company or private equity or a competitor, you want to sell it to your employees. There are 5 important people or entities in this transaction, and understanding how they work together is really important for understanding the transaction, but also for designing this plan well in Canada. Okay, so the first one is the seller. So that's the owner of the business. And the seller is the only one that can decide who is going to buy their business. The decision rests with them. So that individual, or if it's a few individuals, that group of shareholders, has the sole authority to choose the buyer. So the seller's decision to sell to the decision to become employee owned really rests with the seller. And that becomes really important when we think about, the seller's motivation and also how the seller is going to benefit from this. The second is the buyer, and the buyer in this case is the trust. So the trust that's been created is the entity that is going to hold the shares, and it's also the buyer. So for the employees to become owners, the trust needs to be formed. And that trust allows the employees to own the shares as a group in a tax effective way. It doesn't require the employees to buy them. So that trust becomes the purchaser, and it manages the responsibilities of ownership on behalf of all the staff that's working for them. The third entity is the company itself. That's the thing that is being sold. And that is the thing that's going to provide the cash flow to be able to pay for the transition from the seller to the trust, which is on behalf of the employees. So making sure that the company is healthy, that it has the ability to service the debt, because there is going to be debt incurred in a sale, and that there's room for company growth. All those things are going to be important. You have to think about the health of the company as you go through this transition. The fourth one is the employees themselves. So the employees work for the company, and they're the beneficiaries of the trust. So they're going to benefit from the company's profit and or value, depending on how the benefits come out. And we'll talk about the difference in those shortly. All employees are included in this plan, and there's no cost to them personally. So you join a company that has an employee ownership trust, and you become a beneficiary of that trust. And the last one, which often gets forgotten, is the financier. So since employee owners are not bringing their own money to the transaction, the purchase of the company, then these companies are 100% debt financed. Now, a traditional bank, like you would any one of the big five here, or a credit union, can do a transaction for a sale, a leveraged sale, and usually a bank will finance, let's say 30 to 40% of a transaction is pretty much in the normal range, depending on the cash flow and type of business that you have. So the rest of the financing has to come from somewhere. Well, the rest of the financing comes back to the seller. So it's the seller who's going to say, instead of paying me everything today, you can pay me the rest of the money, the other 60 or 70%, slowly over time. And that can be as long as 7 or 10 years, or sometimes longer, depending on the seller and their negotiation with the company. In that case, the money that the bank contributes to the deal is what will go to the lender right away. So they'll come out with 30 or 40%, and the rest of the money will be paid back over time. So this is a highly leveraged deal, but it's a deal that allows all the employees to participate. So that's the gist of how this transaction works. You've now got a 100% leveraged company. The ownership is transferred completely to the employees. The employees are going to work, continuing to do the job that they've always had. And the value is going up to the trust. So first, the company, just like if you have a mortgage on your house that's 100%, the value of the equity in your house is 0. It's going to take some time for you to build that back up. But as you pay more of the loan out over that time period, then the value in your company starts to rise, and you start to have additional cash flow, and either the additional profits can flow over to the employees, or the value of the equity can flow over to the employees. And so in this way, people who are low income are finally able to participate in wealth accumulation, either through the additional profit that they're making that can go into savings, or through the value of the equity, which is building up, just like the value of your house builds up, and you end up having more equity to your name. These are really, really powerful methods for reaching people who are traditionally excluded from participating in any wealth building activities. And it doesn't take anything away from anyone. The seller is getting paid out, the employees are becoming owners, and the company engine is what is making it possible for us to make that transition, the economic engine of the company. So really, really powerful from a social standpoint. And that is really what we are looking to build in Canada. So let's talk about Canada for a second. Why don't we have this here in Canada? Well, to begin with, we don't have a trust structure that allows us to hold shares in this way. So there isn't a trust structure like this. You'll hear from Chad, one of our guests, shortly, that he's found a way to cobble things together as best he can to try to imitate this. It creates a lot of complexity. But basically, we don't have a legislation that permits this to take place. So that is something that we've been doing. We've been working together, a group of us who were very passionate about this from a social perspective, from an economic perspective, that we're passionate about the kinds of results that this can create, have banded together to try to argue for this kind of an entity in Canada so that we can see companies, instead of transitioning to large or potentially, overseas buyers of our mid-sized companies, that we can have Canadians becoming owners themselves just by going to work. And we see the benefits in this are not just to the employees directly. Employees do tend to earn higher wages. They tend to retire with more assets, more savings, but they also tend to have things that maybe aren't financially quantifiable. For example, twice as many businesses that are employee-owned will send their employees for education, so they'll pay for additional education. Employees tend to stay longer in companies. Fewer employees get laid off during downturns. And there's a large culture change that happens too, as everybody starts to realize that, I may not understand what the person in HR does when I'm working at the front line, but I know that both of us are contributing to the success of the company. And we start to see the building of something that's so rare these days, which is trust. Everybody working together for a common outcome that benefits everyone, regardless of what your political or ideological background is. And that spills over not just through the company, but also into the community around them. And that's exactly what we want to see. We want to see Canada forming a basic legislation that has the following characteristics: that allows for trust to be created, that makes it streamlined and simple and efficient, that allows everyone in the company, all employees, to participate at no cost to themselves, and that incentivizes owners to do this. Because if you remember back to the conversation that owners are, who they can sell to, you're looking at two very powerful drivers, these strategic acquisitions and private equity. They have a lot of money to spend. When you sell to your employees, you have to sell at what's called a fair market value, which is an assessed value. And just like the assessed value of your house can be a lot less than what you would achieve if you sold it on the market, on the open market, the owners are often taking a lower price when they're selling to their employees, and they're not getting paid for sometimes 7 or 10 years. So those are powerful disincentives working against sellers transitioning to their employees, and we want to level the playing field. So incentives to help owners make that transition without feeling like they're taking such a loss is a really important part of what we're arguing for as well. And with those things in place, we are excited that Canada also will be able to have a vibrant employee-owned environment where more companies have the ability to stay in small towns, have the ability to transfer the wealth that is created in them to the employees that work there, and to build these legacies over time. So that's the gist of employee ownership and why we want to see it. And I am very blessed to have a group of panelists here to help me with questions, but I'll let Muska jump in quickly here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tiara, for that very informative summary and overview. I think that will also help set the context for the discussion to follow. So now it's my pleasure to welcome the rest of the speakers. We are joined by John Schell. John is the Managing Director and Partner at Social Capital Partners, SCP, an independently funded nonprofit founded in 2001. Social Capital Partners' mission is to build a more resilient economy through broad-based ownership and quality employment. Prior to joining the Social Capital Partners, John co-founded the largest veterinary service providers in both Canada and Australia. Welcome, John. We're also joined by Chad Friesen, apologies. Chad is the CEO of Friesens Corporation, an employee-owned company based in Altona, Manitoba. Friesen helps people share their best story with the world through the power of print. They operate 4 businesses that produce high-quality books, yearbooks, packaging, and publishing services. Chad sits on the board of Red River Mutual, and Manitoba Business Council. Both John and Chad are also members of the steering committee of the Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition. And last, but certainly not least, we're also joined by Dave Fitz-gerald. Dave is the CFO of Carris, a 100% silver employee-owned company. Dave has been with the enterprise for 30 years and has served as the chair of the ESOP Association, president of the New England chapter, and now as the chair of the Employee Ownership Foundation. During his free time, Dave writes historical fiction. His novel, If It's the Last Thing I Do, features a company transitioning to employee ownership during the 1970s and 1980s. Now also funding on Kickstarter. Please stay tuned for the July 2023 publication date. Thank you so much, John, Chad, and Dave, for joining us. And now over to you, Tiara, to moderate this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Muska. So these are all people who are very experienced, either in Canada or in the US. I'm super excited to have all of you. But I think the first thing that I just want to ask is to David and to Chad, who both run employee-owned companies. What is it like to be an employee-owned company, and how does it feel different from a regular company?
Yes.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. You know, it was interesting, Tiara, as you were talking earlier. It's like, gosh, you're describing the company that I've lived in for 25, 30 years. So first of all, Carris is a company that makes packaging for the wire and cable industry. And so basically we make two circles, a tube between, and that becomes the packaging for wire and cable. We have 20 roofs across North America, throughout the US, location in Mexico, and for roofs also in Canada. And we can talk about the Canadian part of that later if you want to, but from my perspective, a couple of brief phrases summarize the experience for me of employee ownership. And, you know, one is a stake in the outcome, which I think is something that you often hear employee-owned companies talk about. The other is a sense of belonging. And then the third is shared ownership, because the concept of owning something together is different than owning something by yourself. At the company, we like the saying, there's ownership in everything we do. We like it so much, we had it trademarked. So hopefully we invented that. While it is idealistic, though, we must always try to make it be as true as possible. And certainly that's always a challenge. We have three corporate values in the company: safety, being driven by our customers' needs, and ownership is our third corporate value. For employees, I often say that the ESOP is not a get-rich-quick scheme, because at first when they hear about it, I think that's maybe the excited leap that someone makes. I describe it instead as it's a do really well over a very long period of time kind of a program. When we're just starting to talk about employee ownership with people, I ask them, hey, what does it mean to own something? And that usually leads us to talking about three different things of what does an owner get? The owner gets the profits. The owner gets the value of the business on down the road. And the owner gets to make all the decisions and decide what will happen. At least maybe that's what an owner thinks they get, is those three things. You know, I think about the way the model of ESOP works, and the way the sharing of the units that go in every year is spread out across all employee owners, not equally, but proportionately. It certainly is a very broad-based way of distributing wealth. When we distribute profits, or our version of that is what we call profit share, which is kind of like dividends. Those tend to get distributed and spent very, very quickly. But it's the value that's in the ESOP accounts that I think actually creates wealth. It used to be that employee owners didn't have enough retirement to retire comfortably at 65. And now after a couple of decades of this, we have everyday employee owners retiring comfortable earlier than 65. And very few, very few tend to stay beyond 62 years of age, whereas before almost everybody uncomfortably retired at 65 or 67. So the last thing I'd say is that it's a balancing act between rights and responsibilities and risks and rewards. And you're always looking for that perfect balance. And hopefully we've gotten pretty close through the years.
All right, my turn. So Friesens has been employee owned in some way, shape, or form since the 1950s. And we can go into more detail on some of those structures later if you want to ask questions on that vein. But we have 655 employee owners today, and we're owned by 100% by an employee trust. We call it an employee trust. It's not quite the same as what Tiara was explaining because it's quite a bit more work for us. But what does it mean to be an employee-owned company? For us, it's everything. First of all, at an individual level, I wouldn't be with this company if it wasn't for employee ownership. It has a mission that drew me to it. Our company probably wouldn't be in Altona, Manitoba today if it hadn't been for employee ownership. We would have been sold and acquired and probably consolidated at some point in the 80s or the 90s. And yet since then, since really the 70s and 80s, this company has generated hundreds of millions of dollars for employee owners. And that's been in a number of different employee ownership models, but it's really created tremendous wealth for a very small community. And so we're in a community of 4,500 population, and we employ 655 employee owners. So when we distribute ownership proceeds, they're done very much as either a profit share or an in-year dividend. And it usually equates to somewhere around 20% of an individual employee owner's income. So you take their wages for the year, and about a 20% factor of that becomes profit sharing and dividends. And so that's a pretty tremendous. Last year we would have had over 10,000. Our average employee owner would have taken home over $10,000 in additional employee ownership benefits. And so that is it's not life altering, or say it's not life changing necessarily. You're not millionaires, but it's certainly a life altering. It's allowing people to send their kids to schools and do renovations on their homes and save for retirement. And so the economic impact from that is quite tremendous. And so for us, where we are in our history, I would say it's been everything for this company.
Love that. Thank you, Chad and Dave. And I'm going to throw it back to Chad and then to Dave. Tell me a little bit about what are the most important things that support the culture of employee ownership that you have, and how does that make it effective? So
one of the things goes back to one of your earlier comments about stable companies. And so stability, certainly it creates an environment for employee ownership to thrive. And so startups probably not necessarily the right model for employee ownership. Not necessarily. It's not for a rebuild or a recovery type of business where you're looking for stable environments. And so that's obviously one of the things that's helped Friesens a lot for that many years is we've provided stable employment, stable returns. Things move up and down year to year, but overall, over the lifespan of most employees' time, it's been very stable. But that also goes to alignment. You talked about alignment and trust, and so that to us is at the core of what we're doing. And we think we use the term servant leadership and this idea that we come to work for each other. And one of our taglines is it's we before me. And this sentiment that we're all in it together, social good for each other, for our families, for the community, et cetera. So we try to link that thread all the way through from the individual right through to the broad stakeholder group that we're doing it. So that communication becomes really, really critical because we have to remind ourselves. It's easy to become complacent and just say, wow, we're just running a business here. But we are very deliberate about making sure that we're communicating to each other on a regular basis, why it's meaningful, the type of impact that we're making as a group. And that just fosters that alignment and that trust. And it also becomes a fantastic brand story. Everybody wants to be a part of a great story. And so we've been able to be a part of and perpetuate a great story. And so whether it's customers or new recruits or existing employees, there's a lot of stakeholders that would say, yes, I want to be with you because you have a great story to tell, and we want to be aligned with great people. And so that's been one of the best drivers of recruitment, retention, and also growth in our market. And so those would be a couple of the keys.
That's great. And David, what about you at Carris Reels?
Yeah, I was agreeing with just about everything Chad was saying as he was talking for us as well. A couple of other things that I thought of come to mind is, forming a community and knowing other companies who have the same sort of stuff and feel the same way and exchange, best practices for culture, but it gets kind of woven into the fiber of our being so much that we kind of forget that we do all these special things sometimes until we're sharing with other people. I mean, the fact that we're employee owned is printed on everything, and we celebrate Employee Ownership Month, so celebration is a part of it. Constant education of what it means, both technically and culturally. And we have a program we're rolling out called Certified Employee Owner Program, which is a series of videos that, educates about all things to do with ESOP and employee ownership. And here at our company, when we say there's ownership in everything we do, we have uniquely, our company is 100% employee governed also, meaning that we do have employees on the board. We have employees on our ESOP trustee committee and on our ESOP communications committee, really at every level. So I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, it flows through all parts of the company. That's amazing. David, in addition to being the CFO of an employee-owned company, you've been widely involved in the culture of building employee ownership across the US. Can you put that hat on for a second and give us some key lessons that you have from your experience in the US and maybe how Canadians might want to adopt those?
Yeah, so as part of the Employee Ownership Foundation and being involved in, in wanting to see the formation of ESOP as a movement and wishing that we could grow instead of having 6,500 ESOP companies in the US, what if it could be 10 times that much? And so it gets kind of frustrating when we see, well, some get formed and some get unformed, unwound, or sold, terminated, or otherwise become something else. And so looking at how to harness the power of what's called the silver tsunami is something that we're also looking at. How can we make even more of this since it works so well? So yeah, did you have more to that question? Because I feel like
what do you think are the things that are making it so successful for employees in the US?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'm more, drawn to want to think about how it could be even more successful. But I mean, if it were up to me, I would have the path be super simple. If maybe we had a ready-made way of ESOPs being formed and taking down the whatever barriers are in existence, whether it's from finding, as you've mentioned earlier, the funding challenges is one thing. Having those valuations that at the start be questioned subsequently, having that not be a barrier would be nice. But I think that finding the experts, finding others who've been down the path, finding others who think of it as so commonplace it's not extraordinary. I think that's a really helpful way to spread the word and to have people that hadn't ever thought of this model think of it as like, hey, yeah, maybe that could work for me. So I guess that's a couple of quick suggestions.
That's a great ambition to have. Thanks, David. John, I'm going to kick it over to you. Social Capital Partners has really been leading the charge on this for several years. You were at the forefront of all of that. So how do you think those lessons that Dave has talked about, or what's been happening in the US, resonates with what's happening in Canada? And what do you feel are our specific roadblocks or challenges in Canada right now?
Thanks, Tiara, and Dave, Chad. Nice to be hanging out with you on this call and everyone who's joined. Look, just stepping back, we didn't know very much about employee ownership at Social Capital Partners until 2019. We started learning about the ESOP in the US. And to learn more, what we did is we went to the National Center for Employee Ownership Conference in Pittsburgh in 2019. And I've been to a lot of conferences in my time. I've never been anywhere with this specific vibe. And the best way I could describe it is there were people from across the US there. There were Republicans, there were Democrats, and the feeling in the in the room, in every room we went into, was one of genuine interest in creating a better company for everybody. And it was a completely different feeling to other places I'd been. And we were, frankly, we were hooked. We said, this model will work. It's a different model than what we understand in Canada. It's a different model that I'm used to. So I used to be in more of the private equity roll-up-y world, and this is a completely different experience for me. And so, we came back to Canada saying this is something that we really should have more of in Canada. And, Chad talked about Friesens. There are very few Friesens in Canada, right? I mean, there may be 50, 60, maybe 70 versus the 6,500 in the US and now 1,400 in the UK, all since 2014. So, we started talking to people about that here, Tiara. We talked to politicians, we talked to business leaders, and the response was overwhelmingly positive, right? So we outlined all of the proven benefits from the US, so better wages and better pay outside of the wealth generating benefits. Jobs get to stay in local communities, and there's no better example of that than Friesens, which has been incredibly. What Altona has, I think, 4,000 people in it or something like that, and Friesens employs 600. The benefits you talked about, Tiara, in terms of better performance, fewer layoffs out of recessions because of a completely different incentive structure, right? Which really matters, right? If you come from the private equity world, you know how incentive structures can be really bad and how they can be really different. And employee ownership was showing how it could be really different. And this is all kind of aside from the fact that the average of the 14 million Americans who have an ESOP plan in the US, the average amount in their retirement account is over $100,000 US, which is a massive, it is life-changing. I mean, that those types of amounts. And so people in Canada said, this sounds good. And everyone gets the succession problem that we're facing and understands the risks of having an economy that is more concentrated. I mean, Dave, if you think the economy in the US is concentrated, I mean, check out Canada. I mean, we have one of the most concentrated economies in the world in terms of large companies dominating industries. And what's been happening in Canada is more and more of those acquisitions of smaller companies by bigger companies. So people get the challenge and how this could be beneficial. And it was across the political spectrum, right? From the NDP to the Conservatives, the strong support from Liberals as well. And then across, the greater community. So we formed this Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition in January. We just like, hey, you want to join this thing? It was very sudden. And we had charitable, academic, business. So folks from across the country were interested. This is not a surprise. In the US, it's a very popular idea with Democrats. It's a very popular idea with Republicans. In the UK, when they brought in new rules in 2014, it was brought in by a coalition government, which spanned the political spectrum. All of that is true. So, sounds pretty good. Unfortunately, the political will has not yet translated into legislation. So, in the US and the UK, the objective when legislation was drafted was around how do we facilitate shifts from owners to employees in the simplest way possible that protects workers, protects the taxpayers, and provides incentives to do those. How do we incentivize more employee ownership? That was the objective. And while they're designed differently and neither one is perfect, Each of the US and the UK are designed around that. When you look at the legislation, it's clear that the purpose of that legislation is to create more employee ownership. That's its objective. That's not so clear when you look at the Canadian proposed legislation. It isn't clear exactly what the objective is, and I'll illustrate quickly just with a bit of an example. The other day, I had someone connect me to the CEO of a company in Ontario, has about 100 employees. It's an engineering company, operates around the world. The owner is in his mid-70s, has owned it for 30 years. And he said, look, I was pretty excited about this employee ownership stuff. I am really worried. All my competitors are in Europe. I don't want to sell to them. I know what it will do to my company. I'm in a relatively small community. I don't want to sell to private equity. I've had friends who've done that, and I'm really scared. I'm like, this is great. This is the person we've designed this for. He wants to sell to his employees. This is exactly what we want. And he said, but I looked at the legislation that was proposed in the most recent budget, and I'm confused. He said, first of all, I don't qualify, right? So the legislation is written so that if you have extensive operations overseas, you can't become an EOT. He said, I don't understand the governance approach. So, in Canada, I won't get into the details, but there's some very, I don't know what the right word is, new, different, radical, potentially, approaches to governance in this legislation, which involves employees democratically electing trustees even before the transaction happens. And he said, look, what do I do if this thing falls apart? What if the transaction doesn't happen? There's all sorts of risk that's introduced. And he said, I understood that there were all sorts of incentives in the US and the UK for these things for owners like me, so that I wouldn't sell to private equity and so that I wouldn't sell to some, a competitor in Europe. And there are no incentives in here for me. So doing this is a major sacrifice. I'm in my, mid-70s. So it sounds apocryphal because it sounds like I made this guy up, right? Because he's making all these points, but I didn't. This is a real phone call. And it sort of outlines kind of how much potential there is here in terms of the political will and the sort of the will in the community to have something great, and the challenges we are currently facing around drafting legislation where that is the actual objective.
Thanks, John. Yes, we're up against quite a bit, and we're going to come back in a minute to talk about that. But what I'd like to do, David, is I'd like to switch to you and say, the US has working legislation. Like you said, there are ways to improve it. But if someone wanted to transition, this isn't right for every company. It's not right for every owner. If somebody wanted to transition, what should they be thinking about going into a transition like this? And which companies are better suited to transitioning to employee ownership?
So, my gosh, I think that the best companies, certainly have to have enough of a size to make the legal costs and so forth, worthwhile. Maybe that's something like, depending on the industry, 20 or 25 employees and more. And probably the largest companies, this isn't probably right for the largest companies. So somewhere in the middle, in between there is probably the right kind of company. And I think the remaining local, those are possibly the companies. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity in the small and mid-sized companies that span both countries, the U.S. and Canada. So I think that if the legislation could somehow be made to fit together, that would be good. So my advice would be, first of all, pick good, expert professionals, seasoned professionals who've done, these kind of, helped with the kinds of formation transactions before, and then find others, who have been down the same path and learn from them, exchange best practices and get to know them. And then when you're just starting out, I think, new employee owners are going to be hearing things that they never thought of hearing before. It might be helpful for them to meet folks from another successfully employee-owned company who can talk about their successes and maybe how it works for them. People can be very skeptical even when good things are happening to them. So being reassured and, in our case, when the company started down the path, they wanted to hear that, no, the company's president, Bill Carris, was not going away. he was just arranging for this transition. Maybe that isn't a reassurance that can always be given, but wherever reassurances can be made to the skeptics, that can be helpful. And the other thing is, I think, telling people what it is and what it is not, what it means and what it does not mean. For instance, you're going to still have to, do largely maybe the same job. Maybe you will have more participation opportunities or even governance opportunities, but you're not going to be setting your own hours, firing your boss, or whatever else, people imagine. So I guess those are a couple of the quick thoughts on that.
Thanks, Dave. Sounds like there's a lot to think about when making the transition, right? Chad, I did want to kick it over to you and ask, one of the things that Canada is definitely dealing with is hollowing out of some of our smaller town areas. And Altona is such an amazing example of what happens when employee ownership, allows the company to stay in the town. Can you tell me how employee ownership is a major consideration for smaller communities and other small impact organizations, particularly from your perspective? Yeah,
so in a word, preservation. And that is, I think, the biggest impact for small communities. Obviously, I don't think employee ownership only plays to small communities, but we're a bit of a microcosm here because of where we operate. Very large, mid-sized company operating in a small community in a relatively remote area of the country. We've actually seen 4 or 5 companies that have sold within our community, and they've been consolidated. And usually the acquiring company would retain some operations in the community for a period of time, but inevitably 5-10 years later, there's this slow trickle down effect. And I don't like to use negative terms. And so what I would say is the community needs to retain their tax base instead of thinking about losing a tax base. You're trying to retain your tax base for the future. You're trying to retain your decision making. And so imagine you're trying to get some major initiative done in the municipality or in the community, and you have fewer and fewer companies or decision makers that are there to try and move things forward. It just becomes more difficult. And as companies trickle out of your community, you're also losing some of your highest paying jobs. And so those are some of not only your big contributors to the tax base, but also often some of your community leaders, some of your fundraisers, volunteers. There's all sorts of trickle down effect to not preserving these businesses. And to me, that's the number one opportunity from a Canadian standpoint, is we don't want to be a country that's heavily concentrated or more concentrated than we are today in 4 or 5 major urban centers. And so the opportunity that employee ownership provides, because one of the other things, Tiara, is that I'm a part of an economic development group that tries to attract businesses to a small regional area. And it's difficult. How are you going to, difficult to try and convince owners that are trying to move entities of 400 or 500 jobs to, we're going to move to southern Manitoba, when they have options all across the country, and they've got municipalities that are throwing money at them to try and win their business in their region. And so the sell of trying to get new businesses to come into a less populated region is daunting. And so preservation is really the only path to maintaining these communities and trying to grow from what already exists, because new is not coming in at the rate as it used to.
Those are great points, Chad, not just about that it keeps people and businesses there, and what the economic impact is, but also how hard it is to bring ones if you don't have them there already. Yeah. That leads me to this other question that I'm going to throw to John first, which is, how can employee ownership support social equity and build an inclusive and resilient economy within communities, small and large?
Thanks, Tiara. And first, I'll just answer one question that's coming up a lot in the chat, just around what these trusts are designed to do. There's a lot of employee ownership that isn't this. right? This is a very particular form of employee ownership. For startups, stock options are a very effective way to distribute ownership. Starting as a co-op is a very effective way to distribute ownership among employees. This is very much targeted at something where there is no answer, which is the succession of privately held businesses to employees when an owner is looking to retire. And just to put some numbers on that, there are 140,000 companies in Canada between 20 and 500 employees, which is the target for this, which employ 5 million Canadians, right? It's like a massively bigger a market than any other market for employee ownership. And it's one for which we have no actual answer in Canada. And to your question about resiliency, Tiara, look, it's all about the incentives of ownership, right? What are they trying to do? And, the incentive to move a head office, right? It depends on what are the incentives of the owners. And if the owners are the employees governed by a trustee who has a fiduciary responsibility to act on behalf of those employee owners, what is their incentive to move the company, right? It's very low. In a recession environment, and this has been proven out through 3 straight recessions in the US, getting more dramatic, frankly, every time, that in a recession, fewer employees are laid off at employee-owned companies, wages stay higher, and they perform better coming out of recession because wages stay higher and people are still there. And why is that? Because the owners of that company are willing to sacrifice short-term profits during the recession in order to maintain employment because they're the owners. And so there are clear incentive reasons behind the resilience and social implications, not to mention the studies, in the US, which show that the wage and benefit effects of employee ownership are large and way larger for women and people of color. So that again is part of this broad-based approach to employee ownership, where everyone gets shares, everyone participates, everyone gets benefits, driven by the strings that government attach for. That's how it becomes social policy. Government provides some sort of incentives and attaches strings, and those strings produce a social outcome. That's how it works.
Thank you for your passionate response, John. I love that. David, what about you? Do you also have, examples and things that you've seen in terms of the way employee ownership supports social equity?
So a couple of things that I would think of right off the bat is, first of all, that I think ESOP companies or employee-owned companies are more likely to have other retirement plans than the ESOP Trust retirement plan. Compared to our competitors, we don't just have the ESOP, but also the other retirement plan. And I think also I'm not sure of whether such studies exist, but I just have this sense that employee-owned companies donate more to charity than non-employee-owned companies do. We've always had that as a stated percentage of 3% of operating income as a part of our, expectations. And in our case, we set that aside every year, and then we allocate it to the various divisions and employee owners at each of our sites, make the decisions as to which charities to support. And of course, it's more likely to go to charities that the employee owners in those communities themselves support and perhaps are active in as volunteers. I don't know that's necessarily a part of ESOP plan structure at all, or just the way things tend to maybe work out in employee-owned companies after a few years.
That's great. So I hear you saying not only, like as John was saying, the ways the employees benefit and the sacrifices they're willing to make during difficult times, but also during good times, that spillover of goodwill is direct impact to the communities. Yeah. Okay, well, John, you've spoken very eloquently about this, and I'm going to toss it back to you one more time to be followed by Chad as well. But obviously, we have draft legislation in Canada, but it's not very good. So what is happening right now with the Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition, and what are the next steps that they're taking towards, improving the legislation?
I mean, like in the UK, there was a public consultation prior to legislation where the government was able to gather a bunch of information in a very open way, led by an expert, who had been supporting employee ownership for a long time. In the US, draft legislation was written by, an expert in the field. The approach so far in Canada hasn't been that as consultative as those, and so we are working now to help government think through what their objectives actually are behind this legislation and suggest some fixes. I mean, I think that the intentions are good. I think the political will is there. I think people want there to be good legislation here in Canada. And so I'm hopeful that it's just a matter of having more and deeper conversations with those who are drafting the legislation to really understand what it is they're trying to achieve with the legislation. Maybe we don't understand it. Maybe there's things that they want to do that are different from done in other countries. But we're hopeful that in those conversations we can come to something that's much better and have something good in place by the end of the year. And and we're going to keep talking to people like this. This is great, right? The more people who know about it, understand it, want to see good legislation here in Canada because they want to see more employee ownership in Canada, the more government will hear that and feel like that's something that they need to deliver on.
Thank you. Chad, how about you? Anything you want to add there?
For sure. One is excitement. So 12 months ago, let's say 18 to 24 months ago, this wasn't even on the radar in Canada. And so thanks to John and the work that his team has done and the coalition coming together, we have employee ownership in legislation. It's not the right legislation because we think they've put some goofy rules around governance and the structure overall, but they're also listening. And one of the challenges would have been if they could have, we would have loved to have them listen earlier before they actually wrote the legislation, but they're listening now. And so what I think has happened is there's been some rules and conditions that have been placed in theory, and they make sense in theory. And then when they hit actual application in the economy, they don't make sense. And so that's what we're trying to help work through. And I'm really encouraged by it because they are listening. We are moving the bar forward. Is it everything that we would have wanted? No, but I am a firm believer that by January 1, 2024, we're going to have a workable model in place.
I agree. I do agree with that, Chad. There is an openness and the coalition is pretty broad, right? And Tiara, you can also speak to this too. And everyone wants to help create something great. There's no one with real vested objectives here, right? I mean, if you look down the list of people who are part of the coalition, I mean, a lot of them are already employee owned and just want more people to be employee owned, and some are just members from the community that don't want to see companies leave their community. There's people that are a nonprofit, right? And we'll never see any fees from anything related to employee ownership. We just think this would make the Canada a better place to live and work. And so there's just genuine interest in getting to an answer that will matter.
I agree with all that. And if I can jump in there to say also, people know that Canada has a challenge here around concentration of wealth and rising inequality, and no one has a silver bullet on how to deal with it. And so when good solutions come along, there is a willingness to try them. However, I do feel like right now we're sort of stuck with legislation that, as we were discussing before this call, is trying to minimize the impact to some existing legislation, to existing tax codes, and has therefore sort of missed the ability to maximize the benefit that we can get out of this. So hopefully that's something that we can help them see the light on, and we can move towards better legislation. I did want to do sort of a rapid fire style of questions here just quickly, and I'd like to actually start with David. It'll be the same question for everyone, but David, if an organization is considering employee ownership, what's a key action that they could take right now?
A little bit ago, I heard I went to a conference and met a whole bunch of people who are doing this, and was swept away by how into it the folks are. Yeah, study, learn, and meet others who are making the same or similar journeys, I think would be a good way to start.
Chad, what about you? Can you give us the how a Canadian company should think about this?
Yeah, so I think first of all, to do some soul searching, because regardless of what legislation comes in, it's still going to be a little bit more work, and it's going to be disruptive. And so one is is that the legacy that I want to leave? And we need motivated sellers. And you started off with that being the key. They're the linchpin, but they really need to be ready for the effort that goes into making it happen. And I think, businesses need to also do a bit of an inventory of, do we have the leadership team in place that can actually run this business as an employee-owned company long term? If it's and that's why we talked about the scale of the business matters, right? And so if you're an owner and all decisions come through your office and nothing moves in the company until you say so, that's maybe not the foundation for a great employee-owned structure. And so you have to do first of all, an inventory of your company. Am I willing to go for the ride? Inventory of the company. And then the last thing I would say is just get some really good advisors on board. We've had lawyers, fantastic team of lawyers that have helped us navigate through what hasn't been a really conducive model in Canada. We've leveraged a great team of lawyers. We've worked with our accounting firm extensively to try to help model some of these things out for us. And so really rallying maybe some tax advisors as well, rallying a few people around you that can help advise through the transition is critical. And so those would be a few tips or ideas for people that are considering how to advance their company forward.
Lovely. And John, what about you?
Just super quick, we helped finance with the Healthcare of Ontario pension plan a sale of Taylor Guitars to its 1,400 employees, 100% of Taylor Guitars to its 1,400 employees a couple of years ago, and they were a textbook example of what you should do, right? So they ahead of time, several years ahead of time, started building a management transition plan. Help those folks understand what it was going to look like to be employee owned, started building more ownership culture throughout the company. Even though the employees don't learn about the transaction until after the transaction takes place, they've done so much internally to make that company operate in a way that would be conducive to employee ownership. Then once it did take place, it was a very, very seamless transition, but it did take a lot of work ahead of time.
Thank you, John. And thank you to all of you. And now I'm going to turn and pull out some questions that have come from the audience. So we've been collecting them as we go out of the chat. Don't worry, we're not ignoring you. I'm going to start with a question from Shauna Ray, which is a common question that we get. And actually, I was thinking to give this to John, but Dave, you maybe also want to weigh in on this. How is this trust structure different from a co-op structure?
Well, we don't really know what this trust structure looks like yet, but in theory, at least in the US and the UK, the major difference is the indirect ownership through a trust, right? So in a cooperative structure, and it's not always true of a cooperative structure, I should say, but in many cooperative structures, worker cooperative structures, all employees get to vote on a lot of the different decisions that get made at the company. And as a result, while wonderful and very viable corporate structures, they tend to be relatively small. Once they scale and become very big, there's some examples in Europe, they often use differentiated structures that are quite complex. So the major difference is that the employees that the management of the company doesn't actually change. What changes is who benefits from the wealth generation of that company. It now becomes employees, but it doesn't dramatically change, or shouldn't dramatically change, how the company is governed on a day-to-day basis. And the example we like to use, if you think about a manufacturing company, a 200-person manufacturing company in Vaughan, Ontario, say, that has been run in a certain way for 60 years by the family who founded it, and you want all the future benefits all to go to employees. You don't want to the next day switch governance entirely and management entirely to one employee, one vote. You want something that will ensure the sustainability of that company long term, so that those benefits can truly accrue to workers. And that's what this structure is intended to do.
David, do you want to add anything there?
I'm not really an expert on EOTs or co-ops, although I think one difference is, I think in co-ops employees have to fund their investment in some kind of way. I'm not sure how exactly that occurs, or whether it's a significant amount that has to be invested. Maybe it's done through payroll withholdings over a period of time or something. I'm just not sure. The point of one employee, one vote, I think in corporate decision making, it doesn't have to be a zillion things that get voted on. I mean, the purview of the board of directors is really not a large number of decisions that would necessarily be made frequently with voting. We at our company have written into our ESOP plan the one employee, one vote, which is uncommon in ESOPs, but it isn't used that frequent. It doesn't come up that frequently, actually. In day-to-day operating activities, that we don't vote on day-to-day operating things.
Thank you, David. And noting that, these models can have a certain amount of flexibility to them, but it really is about purpose of like what the intent is behind them. But there is certainly a lot of overlap. We've got a question now from Andrew Greer, and he asked, what is the difference between what is possible now in Canada and what we're advocating for with a trust? And Chad, I'd like to kick that to you, since you've done, I would say, you've maximized what's possible in Canada.
Yeah, so we've essentially built it from ground up without any support from the government. The founding family, which I share the last name of, but I'm not related to, was really, we talk about cooperative, a little bit of a different angle, was really heavily influenced by the cooperative movement of the 40s and 50s. And so that, when we think about linkage, absolutely, there's some support and linkage throughout. But we've essentially had to build it ourselves. And so we use a trust that's not designed to hold assets in perpetuity. And so the current trust model has a 21-year rule. Most trust models have a 21-year rule attached to them, which essentially requires the trust to divest of the assets before that 21-year anniversary. Whatever assets are left in the trust as of that anniversary are subject to capital gains tax. And obviously that makes sense when you're thinking about family trusts and other trust types of entities. But as an employee-owned company, we have no intention of liquidating the assets of the company for our own benefit. And so the idea of having a trust model that gets rid of that 21-year rule that essentially allows companies or trusts to hold the assets of a company in perpetuity for the benefit of the employees of the organization. To us, that's one of the big breakthroughs along the way. And ultimately, we talk a lot about tax incentives as well. We also want to see further tax incentives for the sellers to be incentivized, because like I said before, it's difficult to set up. So for instance, today, before the new trust becomes law, we actually set up brand new trusts every 7 years and go through the administrative hassle of trying to bounce our way through to try and avoid having major tax events for our employee owners. And so any new seller that's looking down that path and saying, boy, that seems like a lot of work and a lot of administrative loopholes that I got to jump through, thanks, but no thanks. It's a great concept, but it's too much work. And I think that's ultimately the objective for anything that comes out now would be make it as simple as possible so that we can incentivize those sellers to actually take that journey and transition it to their employees.
Thanks, Chad. That's excellent. Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Two questions that have come up a lot. Why isn't this done at the startup or creation stage of an enterprise? And also, can this be done in advance of succession? So can it be done as something where, the owner is still involved and the company puts this in place more as a mechanism to distribute wealth and create equity and bring the team together? So that's really about the life cycle stages. David, I'm going to ask you to talk about it, and then also maybe John.
Yeah, maybe I'd jump on the second one there. I mean, in our case, the selling shareholder, president of the company, started that journey of researching the transition in his 40s, and it was completed. It was in the first transaction was done when he was in his early 50s. So it wasn't until much later that we became 100% employee owned. And so for our employees who didn't want to hear that he would be leaving right away, it was, I think, a comforting transition, for them at the time. So yeah, no, it doesn't need to be done, immediately, upon the, an exit of the selling shareholder from his or her position in the company doesn't need to happen at the same time. I mean, unless it happens because of a health event or something like that.
Thanks, Dave. John?
Yeah, in terms of the startup, the important thing is that in a startup environment, there are options, like pretty useful options that already exist to help distribute ownership among the employees. Like I said, stock options are very powerful at the start of a company, and you could start as a worker co-op where you wouldn't need a lot of capital from everyone else. So the difference is for the succession world, there are no real useful tools, and that's the gap that this is trying to fill. And look, the best case scenario, the best examples of employee-owned companies, the owner does stick around, right, and is involved after a transition for what could be a long period of time, right? The objective is to distribute wealth in a way that's simple and doesn't affect the company and has some benefit to the owner, but the owner often will stay around for a very thoughtful transition as long as the legislation allows for that.
That's great. Thank you. We have another question that's come up, and I'll put it out there, whoever feels that they can speak to this, but this question is from Heather Hatchigan, and she asked, can other community members or stakeholders like suppliers, consumers, charities be brought into the trust structure as beneficiaries?
I can speak to that. We've created a number of trusts over the last several years, and we're very deliberate to it's one of the, from a legal standpoint and from an oversight standpoint, we're very deliberate to be clear as to the beneficiaries are the employees of the active employees of the company. And so we've at times talked about, wow, it'd be easier as trustees if we had this broader group of defined beneficiaries, and then we could just pick and choose who gets what any given year. That starts to really create an environment where you could have disparity or inequity between different parties. And so we've been pretty deliberate to ensure to keep focus on, you have to really be an employee of the organization, because if we start getting down that path of adding all sorts of different definitions of beneficiaries as your trust moves forward, especially now that you're essentially going to be in the same trust in perpetuity, that you don't get into a situation where trustees can manipulate the trust for some unintended result.
And the only thing I'd add to that, Tiara, is that this is a very purpose-built idea, right? So these trusts are about this one specific problem we're trying to solve, which is the succession of owners in a simple and thoughtful and incentivized way. There's all sorts of creative stuff going on all around that involve new trust structures, new cooperative structures that involve communities and other, the environment, kind of other stakeholders, right, in a company or in a nonprofit, and those are great. This itself needs to be a super focused program because of the size of the market it's trying to penetrate and the types of people we're trying to engage. Right? You need tax lawyers, tax accountants, wealth advisors, all saying, do this simple thing for these specific and simple reasons so it can scale. And if it becomes more complex, then this one particular thing we're trying to solve becomes a lot harder.
Great answers. Great. My next question is from Shane, and Shane says, employee ownership deeply resonates, and meeting the opportunity of the silver tsunami is vital for wealth equality. It's been operating in the US and Europe for decades. Why hasn't it scaled? Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
It is on why employee ownership hasn't scaled in Europe and in the US?
Yes, that's the question.
It's scaling in the UK. I mean, probably as fast as it's scaled in any country since the tax incentives were first introduced in the US in the mid 80s. Last year, about 300 companies sold to their employees in the UK, and it was somewhere between 5 and 10% of all transactions. There's a certain limit to how much of the economy these can be. And we have to be realistic about that. If we can get to 5 to 10% in Canada, that would be a massive, massive shift. There will always be owners who will want to sell to the highest bidder, and that's, it's their company. So you can't tell them they can't do that. And so even in the UK, where it's a super simple program, maybe too simple, frankly, and a very simple tax incentive, it's still 90 something small, like 91, 92% of owners still choose to sell in other ways. And that's okay. I think there are other, employee ownership isn't the answer to everything. But it can be, and I think Tiara mentioned this, it can be a super important part of the answer if it's designed properly. And they've done that in the UK. US, the reason it hasn't scaled, and I think Dave would agree with this, has a lot to do with complexity. The tax incentive is complicated and the structure itself is complicated. It's tied to a very specific retirement plan. All of this is legacy, from when it was started. So it's kind of 1 to 2% of all transactions. And so, if in Canada, if we could design something that really hits the ball down the fairway, right, where we take the wealth building and, and sort of growth attributes of the US and combine it with the simplicity of the UK, including some of the oversight that the US has that is actually quite useful, we could design a really great program here in Canada, and a flexible program that can be used in a bunch of different environments.
David, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, gosh, I would suggest that if you're going to copy that oversight, make it at least a little more functional. I don't know how best to put that. In spite of all the barriers that are mentioned, I still think, gosh, it's so worth it. Having lived, but yeah, they're having lived here for decades inside of an ESOP. But yeah, some of those barriers are tough, like the financing, difficulty. Do you combine the bank financing with seller financing, mezzanine financing? Do you want to create a huge debt for a company that's just starting as a new version of itself? And I think, the problem that many sellers want to sell for a premium, not for fair market value, is another thing that keeps us from going to scale. Maybe if there was some other way to get beyond just 100% of fair market value as the limit, that we could maybe see more, and not having to leave a lingering liability behind that, oh my gosh, 5 years from now or whatever, someone might find an issue with the valuation that happened at the transaction point. Those would be, improvements that I think would take it more to scale and could make it, twice as more frequent, or even 5 times more frequent. But John, you're probably right. There probably is a limit to quite what percentage penetration in the overall economy employee ownership could get to.
Yeah, I think those are great points. It's not right for every seller and it's not right for every company, but there are certainly barriers that could be removed that could allow the maximum to participate.
If I could just add one quick thing on that, Tiara. I mean, I think we should emphasize the power of what is happening in the US, right? So, and in the UK, we've talked about the UK, but in the US, the 250 companies that are formed every year have an average employee base of 200 people. Eventually, and this has been proven across all ways you look at the US system, every employee will have over $100,000 in their retirement account through this program. That's $5 billion a year in worker wealth, right? And then, of course, all the incentives that we've discussed. So massively valuable. We should talk about what we should expect in Canada if the legislation doesn't change, if what's been introduced continues to be the way it is. There are some researchers in the US named Andrew Robinson and Andrew Pendleton. They have been researching employee ownership in the UK for decades, well before they introduced better incentives and a better structure in 2014. They compared what's been proposed in Canada to the employee benefit trust, which existed in the UK before 2014, which almost nobody did. Right? It was an unincentive model. It was frankly much more flexible than what's been introduced. So they said the upside of Canada would be 6 a year. And they believe that to be an overestimate because of how complex the Canadian version is versus the UK version. So we have a ways to go till we have to worry about the scale issues that are true in the US and the UK.
Sorry, I see I'm on mute there. Thank you, John. I was going to say we have time for one last question, and this question is from Sean Walter. Sean's question was, do these trusts in other countries have a specific definition of an employee? I'm thinking about part-time requirements as an example. And Chad, I'd actually like to kick this over to you. You can also maybe talk about how your company qualifies somebody to participate.
Okay, so very quickly then, we have our rule would say any full-time or part-time employee. So you have to be an employee, not a contractor, not an associate. You're an employee of the organization. And the only thing that really changes between full-time and part-time would be your level of participation. So for instance, when we make an EOT distribution, pay dividends, we would use two formulas. First formula is, or first portion of your EOT distribution is based on your compensation. So how much you earn for your regular wages, that goes into a calculation. Basically, you divide your earnings over the last 5 years by the last 5 years of everyone's earnings in that pool, and that determines your percentage of the earnings pool. And then we use seniority, and so we break down a little piece for seniority, very similar model where you take your years of service, you divide that by the total years of service by everyone in the pool, and that determines your percentage of the seniority component. And so we're very deliberate to make sure that everyone qualifies. Essentially, most people after 3 months of probation, they become an employee owner or a beneficiary of the trust. But it takes about 5 years, 5 or 6 years before you get up to your maximum potential, because remember, it's always going back over your last 5 years of earnings. So if you've only been with the company for a year or two, your calculation is going to be a lot smaller than it will be in year 5 and 6. And so that's really the great equalizer, that by the time someone reaches year 5, 6, 7, they have the potential of earning nearly the same as someone that has been with the company for longer. And so there's not this long vetting period where employees have to wait until they've been with the company for 10, 20, 30 years before they reap some rewards. They really scale up within 5 years. And in the first year, by our model is that anyone who starts before November 1st, our year end is December 31st. Anyone who starts before November 1st immediately qualifies as an employee owner for the next payment. And so they'll get a small little nominal amount just to say, welcome to the employee ownership model. And we start some cash flowing early on in the process.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, that's about all we have for time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Muska so that she can finish the session for us.
Thank you so much, Tiara. Wow, that was incredibly informative. Thank you so much, Tiara, John, Chad, and Dave, for this very insightful and energizing session. There were a ton of great takeaways and considerations, and we really appreciate your time and participation and look forward to staying up to date on this work in Canada and continuing to follow your work and the work of Employee Ownership Coalition. And of course, we're also keenly waiting for your book, Dave. Very excited for that publication. Also, thank you to our attendees and all your questions. I think our speakers did a phenomenal job of answering almost all of them. We encourage you to check out the case study. It provides a very comprehensive overview of this work.